Thanks for clicking enjoy the full story. It was early spring when the truck first appeared in front of the house next door. The air was crisp with the promise of warmer days, but the wind still carried a bite. I sat in the living room, a mug of coffee cradled in my hands, the soft hum of the heater the only sound that filled the space. My house was one of those old, creaky places, built in the 1940s with heavy wooden beams and windows that rattled when the wind blew a little too hard. The kind of house where you'd expect an old, quiet couple to live, which, for the most part, was true, until they'd moved out a few months ago, leaving the house empty. At first, I thought nothing of it. Vacancies were common in the neighborhood. People came and went, leaving their mark on the street before vanishing, sometimes for good. But when I saw the truck, with its dull red paint and faded logo, something in my gut shifted. I couldn't explain why. It was just a moving truck, after all. But it felt different. It felt like a signal. The couple moving in didn't stand out immediately. The man, tall and lean, wore a plain navy blue t-shirt and jeans, his face partially obscured by a pair of sunglasses. His movements were quick and deliberate, like someone who wanted to get things done fast. His name, I would later learn, was Thomas. The woman, on the other hand, was harder to read. She had a quiet energy about her, an air of introspection that clung to her. She seemed less interested in the hustle of moving boxes than in taking in the surroundings, staring at the house with a kind of distant curiosity. Her hair was dark, almost black, and pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her face was oval, with high cheekbones and soft eyes that never seemed to focus entirely on anything. There was something delicate about her, but also unsettling. Her name was Elena. I had been watching them for a few minutes from my window when Elena turned and caught my gaze. She didn't smile or wave like most new neighbors would. She simply blinked, a slow, deliberate motion, before returning to her task of carefully arranging a few potted plants on the porch. I thought it was odd, but shrugged it off. Maybe she was just shy. The next few days passed in a quiet blur. I kept to my usual routine, morning coffee, an hour of reading, a walk to the park to get some fresh air, but something in the back of my mind nagged at me. The neighborhood was waking up, coming to life again after a long, quiet winter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the house next door had changed. I noticed, at first, it was little things. Elena would stand by the window sometimes, just staring out without moving. I had no way of knowing for sure, but it felt like she was looking at me, watching me. Not just glancing, but something far more intentional. I'd try to shrug it off, convincing myself it was paranoia. But when I'd go to check the window again, she would still be there. Her presence was so subtle, so quiet, that I couldn't even be sure if I was imagining it. And then there were the times when I would glance over at their house and find her staring directly at me, unwavering, unblinking. There was something in her eyes, a coldness, that unsettled me more than the constant staring. It wasn't like she was waiting for something. It was as if she was expecting something. As if she knew something I didn't. I remember one evening, around dusk, when I stood on my front porch sipping lemonade and watching the street lamps flicker on. The evening air smelled like freshly cut grass, the kind of scent that made you feel like the world was just about to wake up from its long sleep. And then I saw it again. Elena, standing in the window. Only this time, it wasn't just her. There was something behind her, something tall and dark, like a shadow that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a passing car casting its headlights. But as I stared, the shape shifted. It was no longer just a shadow, but a form, a figure that seemed to breathe and sway with a life of its own. I turned quickly, but the image had already burned itself into my mind. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I found myself walking with my head down, trying not to glance toward their house, afraid that I would see something again. But when I came back from the grocery store, carrying bags in each hand, I found myself drawn to their house once more. It was like a magnetic pull I couldn't escape. There she was. Elena, standing in the same spot by the window, her eyes fixed on me. This time, her face seemed less like a person's and more like a mask, empty, distant, like someone who had forgotten what it meant to feel anything. I felt a chill sweep over me, and my pulse quickened. I tried to look away, but it was impossible. I didn't know why, but I had to know what was going on. I walked up to their house, my feet dragging against the sidewalk like they were fighting me every step of the way. The closer I got, the more my stomach churned, like there was something wrong, something ancient about this place, like the house had been waiting for me. When I knocked on the door, I could feel my heart in my throat. The door creaked open just a sliver, and Elena's face appeared, too close, too soon. She stared at me for a beat longer than was comfortable. "Can I help you?" she asked in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, her eyes never leaving mine. "I'm your neighbor," I stammered. "I just wanted to check in, say hello. You've been standing at the window a lot." She blinked slowly, the kind of blink that felt deliberate, like she was processing my words in a way I couldn't follow. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," she said finally, her voice still too calm. It's a new place. I find it difficult to adjust sometimes." I nodded, feeling awkward, but also uneasy. It didn't feel like an apology. It felt more like an explanation, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Before I could say another word, she smiled faintly and stepped back. The door closed with a soft click. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The air felt thicker now, heavier. Something had shifted, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Later that evening, I tried to push the encounter from my mind. But I couldn't. I glanced over at their house once more, and there she was, standing in the same spot in the window. Watching. And behind her, that shadow. Only now, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a shape, a presence. It moved, slowly, deliberately, toward her. I couldn't breathe. I felt trapped in that moment, caught between what was real and what I was starting to suspect wasn't. And then her eyes met mine again. But this time, the shadow didn't stop behind her. It moved with purpose, and I could swear that it was reaching for me. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow moving behind her, reaching toward me. My bedroom felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into my bones and made it impossible to get comfortable. I left the bedside lamp on, casting a warm circle of light across the room, but even that didn't help. The darkness in the corners seemed heavier somehow, like it was pressing inward, waiting for me to make the mistake of looking too closely. By morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Lack of sleep and an overactive imagination, that's all it was. I laughed at myself as I made coffee, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like cobwebs. But when I glanced out the window, the laughter died in my throat. Elena's window was wide open. It wasn't just open, it was hanging awkwardly on its frame, as though it had been forced. The curtain fluttered in the morning breeze, but there was no sign of her. The room beyond the window was dark, too dark for the early sunlight, and I couldn't make out anything inside. That night, I locked every door and window twice. My house was old and the locks were finicky, but I made sure they clicked securely. The unsettling feeling from the morning hadn't left me. Elena's room remained dark all day. I hadn't seen her, not even standing eerily in the yard as she often did. The silence in my house felt thicker than usual, the kind that wrapped itself around you and made every noise seem louder. I left my bedroom door ajar so I could hear if anything moved in the hallway. Somewhere after midnight, I woke with a start. At first, I didn't know why. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. The heater had shut off, it often did at night, but that wasn't it. The house was deathly quiet, and for a moment, I thought maybe I just had a bad dream. And then I heard it, a faint, muffled thud, coming from downstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Another thud, heavier this time, like something had been knocked over. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. My first instinct was to call the police, but a part of me hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I'd imagined the sound? I crept out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and peeked into the hallway. It was dark, but I could see the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the living room window downstairs. Slowly, I made my way to the top of the stairs, gripping the railing tightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I stepped down cautiously, the stairs creaking beneath me. The air felt heavier the further I descended, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. The back door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I cursed under my breath. I was sure I had locked it. I stepped closer, reaching out to shut the door, when something caught my eye. On the floor, near the kitchen, was a trail of wet footprints. Bare feet, heading toward the basement door. My stomach dropped. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Silence. I reached for the light switch, flipping it on. The kitchen flooded with light, revealing the trail more clearly. The prints were smeared, as if whoever had left them had been dragging their feet. The basement door was ajar, the faint smell of damp earth wafting up from below. My hands shook as I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only thing I could think of to defend myself. With every step toward the basement, the air grew colder. I nudged the door open wider with the tip of the knife and peered down. The basement light was on, flickering weakly. "Whoever's down there, I'm calling the police," I shouted. No response. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, each creak of the wood making my heart pound harder. When I reached the bottom, I froze. A man was standing in the corner, his back to me. His clothes were filthy, soaked through with something dark and sticky. His shoulders were hunched, and he was muttering to himself, words I couldn't quite make out. "Hey!" I barked, the knife trembling in my hand. "Get out of my house." He turned slowly, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were sunken, bloodshot, and wild. He took a step toward me, and I instinctively stepped back, my grip on the knife tightening. "You shouldn't have let her in," he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What?" I stammered. "Elena," he said, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You saw her, didn't you? Once you see her, she sees you. She's here now. She's always here." I backed up the stairs, my heart racing. The man didn't follow, but his eyes never left mine. "You can't stop her," he said, his voice echoing in the small space. "She's already inside." I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but when I hit call, the line was dead. No signal. No Wi-Fi. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her. Elena was standing at the far end of the hallway, her head tilted at that unnatural angle, her eyes boring into mine. "You shouldn't have looked," she whispered. The lights flickered and went out. The hallway plunged into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled with the knife, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. "Elena," I called out, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" No answer. The silence stretched, suffocating until I heard it. A soft, wet sound, like bare feet padding across the floor. The sound moved closer, echoing in the oppressive stillness. My eyes strained to adjust to the darkness, but I couldn't see her anymore. I took a step back, bumping into the wall. The knife felt useless in my hand. What was I even supposed to do with it? Then, from behind me, a voice whispered, so close I could feel the breath on my neck. "She's not the only one." I spun around, slashing blindly with the knife, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway stretching behind me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned back to where Elena had been. She was gone. The sound of footsteps started again, this time coming from multiple directions. Upstairs. Downstairs. Around me. They overlapped, moving faster, heavier, like a group of people rushing through the house. My head whipped back and forth, trying to make sense of the chaos, but I couldn't keep track of where the noise was coming from. And then the whispers began. They weren't words, not at first, just soft, incomprehensible murmurs that grew louder with every passing second. They surrounded me, filling the air like a suffocating fog. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head now, worming their way into my thoughts. She's here. She's here. She's here. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and fell hard onto the floor. The knife clattered out of my hand, spinning away into the shadows. I scrambled to my knees, desperate to get up, to run, but my body felt heavy, like I was being held down by an invisible weight. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The man from the basement was crawling up the stairs, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. His eyes were wide, unblinking, locked onto mine as he dragged himself closer. "Elena," he gasped, his voice rasping like sandpaper. "She's everywhere." Behind him, the basement door swung open. And something else emerged. It was tall, too tall to fit through the doorway, yet it did, folding and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its limbs were long and spindly, stretching unnaturally as it moved. Its face, or where a face should have been, was a void, a gaping darkness that seemed to suck in the light around it. The man on the stairs froze, his body trembling. "No, no, no," he muttered, clawing at the floor in a futile attempt to retreat. The thing reached him first. Its shadow engulfed him, swallowing him whole. He didn't scream. He couldn't. His mouth opened, but no sound came out as he was pulled into the darkness. In an instant he was gone. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, rooted to the floor as the creature turned its attention to me. "Elena," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, help me." The figure didn't stop. It moved toward me, its limbs twisting and contorting, its presence sucking the air from the room. And then I heard her voice. "She's here," Elena whispered, her tone soft and sing-song, like a child playing a game. "And now, so are you." From the shadows, she emerged, her head still tilted, her smile stretched too wide. But this time, she wasn't alone. Figures surrounded her, their shapes shifting and indistinct, their faces obscured by the same darkness that cloaked the creature. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Elena knelt beside me, her cold hand brushing against my cheek. Her smile stretched impossibly wide, her eyes dark pools that seemed to go on forever. "Don't worry," she cooed, her voice almost tender. "You'll never be alone again." But then, something unexpected happened. The air in the room shifted, like the drop before a thunderstorm. The creature stopped its advance, its distorted limbs freezing mid-movement. The shadows that surrounded Elena flickered, almost as if they hesitated. For the first time, her smile faltered. A low hum began to fill the room, growing louder and louder until it vibrated in my chest. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the old wood creaking under the strain. I realized the sound was coming from my phone, still lying on the floor where I dropped it. Its screen flickered, glowing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. "Elena," a voice echoed from the phone, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't human. Her head snapped toward it, her eyes narrowing. "No," she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "Not you." The glow from the phone intensified, spreading across the floor like liquid light. The figures around her recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke as the light touched them. The creature let out a guttural, inhuman screech and began to retreat, its twisted limbs flailing as it tried to escape. "Elena!" I shouted, though I didn't know what I was trying to say. She turned back to me, her expression wild with fury and fear. "You don't understand," she screamed. "You're not supposed to fight it. You're supposed to join us." The light surged, flooding the room and forcing me to shield my eyes. When I finally dared to look again, Elena and the creature were gone. The house was silent, the oppressive weight in the air lifted. I stared at the phone, its screen now blank. Slowly, shakily I picked it up. As I turned it over in my hands, a single line of text appeared on the screen. "You're welcome. Don't make me do that again." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't recognize the voice, but somehow, I knew it had been watching all along. I never saw Elena again, and I don't know what became of her or the thing that had taken over my house. But every now and then, when the shadows seem too dark or the silence too heavy, I hear the faint hum of my phone. And I wonder, was it really saving me? Or just biding its time?